So we would like to welcome everyone to our November History for Lunch. Just as a reminder, before we get started today, our next History for Lunch is scheduled for Wednesday, November the 17th at 12 p.m. Mr. Bill Barber will present Buffalo City and the Blunt Patent, a history of logging the Dare mainland. And he is a retired forester in Eastern North Carolina. He will discuss the history of land used by entrepreneurs and speculators on the mainland portion of Dare County. The story will begin in the colonial period and examines the many schemes employed for almost 189 years to log and develop the swampy wilderness. Mr. Barber will also discuss the natural development of logging practices, trade, and transportation within the Albemarle regions. So we do invite you to join us on Wednesday, November the 17th at 12 p.m. But we're going to go ahead and get started with our History for Lunch that we have today. We have Rear Admiral Carlton Moore, who served in the United States Coast Guard, both active and reserve, for over 30 years. In response to the events of 9/11, he served as Deputy Commander, Coast Guard Atlantic Area. He had temporary duty overseas on 6 occasions, including Japan, Bahrain, and Germany. He was awarded the Legion of Merit and Coast Guard Distinguished Service Medal, among other honors. In civilian employment, Governor Schwarzenegger appointed him as Administrator, California Office of Spill Prevention and Response, and he was responsible for a comprehensive environmental protection and response organization. He administered various maritime programs at the state level, affecting the shipping industry, maritime towing companies, and port authorities. And he responded to oil spills and other leaks of hazardous materials on state and federal waters. Previous to that, he was special legal counsel to the administrator. He is a member of the California State Bar. He is the ex-president of the Sacramento chapter of the Navy League and served as president of the Sacramento Optimist Club, supporting programs for disadvantaged youth. He and his wife, Cindy, are retired and living near Lake Tahoe in Northern California. So again, we're going to go ahead and I'm going to turn it over to Rear Admiral Moore. So Mr. Moore, I'm giving it to you.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. We are good to go. Everyone can hear you in our audience.
All right, sounds good. Thank you very much, Lori Meads and your organization for bringing this today. And all of you that are joining us, thanks for taking time out of your schedule. I really like the opportunity to speak about this book. It was a work in progress for about 3 years. And what I decided to do in terms of just giving a brief synopsis and overview of the book is discuss the 3 phases that normally go into writing a book. And discuss a little bit about what inspired me to take on this project. The actual impetus was when I saw a movie that was written, that was a movie after a book written of another Coast Guard rescue called The Finest Hours. The author was Michael Tugius. That particular book involved an overloaded boat that a person went out, or the boat crew went out in very, very hazardous conditions, terrible weather conditions, and had saved the crew, most of the crew, off of a tanker that was grounded on the eastern seaboard. And this was back in the 50s. Disney picked that rescue up and made a movie out of it. And so when I saw the movie, I said, oh my gosh, I recall a very similar rescue in much more modern times involving a Coast Guard helicopter. And I just kind of took that on as a challenge to see if, in fact, that there was enough to put a book together. By way of background, Lori mentioned that, we'll rewind tape here for a second. One of the things I should mention is I was trained as a line officer. I'm not an aviator. A line officer in a Coast Guard and Navy generally is trained to drive ships for float duty. So when I took on this challenge, I kind of looked at it as I'm not an aviator. So what I needed to do was kind of apply the same thing you would do if you're preparing for a trial, is to find all the material witnesses, subpoena all of the documents that are important to your case, and then prepare your presentation. And it essentially worked. We spent probably 8 or 9 months just trying to find and locate what I call material witnesses, the people who flew the mission, and to a certain extent, the people who were at the air station who didn't fly the mission but were in supportive roles. It was difficult in terms of getting a lot of the material because of the time between when I started writing and doing the research and the actual time of the event. The event happened in the year 2000, December 17th of the year 2000. And a lot of the material, at least the record material, had been archived with the National Archives in Atlanta. That actually spawned a requirement for a FOIA request, Freedom Information Act request, just to get my hands on Coast Guard documents. Finding the flight crew for both helicopters and the C-130s was a challenge as well, because during that period of time, the vast majority of the crew members had retired from the Coast Guard. They moved on to other pursuits. They left Elizabeth City for the most part. There are still some in Elizabeth City. So actually got a software program that helped me locate people. And that was an arduous task, but a joyful task. Okay, so when I entered the writing or the research phase, there was a lot of difficulty in finding people, of finding the documents, and also I asked for help from the Coast Guard and following a FOIA request, and the historian at Coast Guard Atlantic area, Dr. Bill Thiessen, was a tremendous help, because a lot of this had been archived also with the Coast Guard, with a historian of the Coast Guard. So when we put up the flag asking for help, a lot of people joined in, and it took a lot of people throughout the research phase just to get to where we are.
You got it.
Oh, one more thing, and I've got a little outline here. One more thing that complicated the research phase was about 1.5 years. There were other treasures that were found along the way. There was a photojournalist by the name of Hall, who had thought that he might want to write a book about this, and he made an article early on for Flying Magazine. Wrote an article, and in that article, he mentioned some of the other folks who flew the mission, and it also helped us to track down these people. He died in I'm sorry, it wasn't 19, it was about 2006. I contacted his wife, and she graciously turned over his entire research file for what he did in reporting this for Flying Magazine. That also helped. And then lastly, some of these things required reprint permission. And without exception and without a dollar, and I'll get to Disney later on, everybody we contacted was graciously helpful in providing not only photographs and the reprint permission for the photographs, but also giving us direction to move ahead to find other stuff. The writing portion wasn't difficult. And by the way, if there's one takeaway from this little session here, and this is my third book, by the way, I found out, and I've heard this from other folks who wanted to get into writing, the writing part is the best part. That's the most fun. Research is fun as well. The worst part of publishing a book is publishing the book, and I'll get to the publication end of it soon. But writing, as it relates to how we set forth a kind of progressive movement from starting early on in the Coast Guard historically, showing how aviation was born in the Coast Guard, and then getting a better focus into how rotary flight started with the Coast Guard, and moved on into other military services. Just really interesting nugget, and I didn't know this after 33 years in the Coast Guard. I didn't know this until I got in and did the research myself, that essentially when Sikorsky made his earlier prototypes available to the military on the basis that the rotary wing aviation might be a tremendous benefit for national defense, there was a Navy admiral by the name of King, and he met with a Coast Guard admiral by the name of Weishi, and together they agreed that the Coast Guard would be the lead agency in developing rotary wing capabilities for the U.S. military. And so that kind of opened the door for the Coast Guard to look at this not only as a national security asset that would be law enforcement and military applications, but search and rescue as well. And I probably should get this right off the top of my head. I'll probably botch it, but Sikorsky is quoted himself as it relates to search and rescue. It says, if you're flying a fixed wing aircraft, you can fly over a rescue and drop flowers. And if you're flying in a helicopter, you can actually land and save lives. It was something like that. But one of the, back to the inspirations thing, I wanted to mention one thing. There are about 4 or 5 books out on the market that talk about the greatest rescue. When I did the research for this particular rescue, the Seabreeze 1, I found out that there was only one rescue where the Coast Guard has actually used that term, greatest rescue. So the only rescue that is in publication right now that is truly the greatest rescue is the one that we're writing about, the Seabreeze 1. Let's see, this is just kind of trivia paperwork stuff here. We went through 4 draft manuscripts before we got to a smooth draft. And at that point, I asked for friends and people who had knowledge of the rescue to do a total review. And as a matter of fact, we had 5 reviewers. 2 of them were commanding officers of air stations. 2 of them actually were flight crew during the mission. And then a friend of mine who's very, very involved in Coast Guard history, Reverend Tim Riker, agreed to do that. So it went through a process of external review before we got to the publication phase. My first choice of publishers was the U.S. Naval Institute Press. And I chose them because I thought with the application, the military story, and the historical perspective, which is kind of mainstream to where their readership lives, I thought that this would be a very, very good opportunity for them to pick it up. And it didn't work out. We spent a year and a half with the Naval Institute. By the way, not many people know this. Tom Clancy started out at the Naval Institute Press, and he did very well. And since that time, the Naval Institute Press decided they were not going to do any fiction anymore. They just do nonfiction, which this book is. But at any rate, we spent about a year and a half with the publisher at the Naval Institute Press, and went through the manuscript, went through 3 substantial changes as a result. I could not get a commitment after that, and they just kept saying it'd like more changes, and it got kind of old. During the process, the research phase, I had contacted a publisher by the name of Arcadia Publishing, and I needed a reprint authority for them. I was using, as part of the historical backdrop leading up to the rescue, I had a segment on Coast Guard Base Elizabeth City, and it was well written. It was a somewhat dated publication. I contacted the editor-in-chief of Arcadia, and by the way, it's a large publishing house. They not only have the History Press, they have Pelican, and there's 4 or 5 other subsidiaries within the organization. But anyway, I contacted him, and he graciously gave us authority. And during the process, he said, "Do you have a publisher in mind?" And I said, "Yes, I do have a publisher in mind." And so that was it for probably almost 2 years. Finally, gave up on the U.S. Naval Institute Press, I went back to Arcadia. I chatted with, his name was Adam Farrell, and I said, would you like to take a look at this manuscript? And he said, yes. And I had a green light within 10 days. I mentioned earlier that the publication part is the hardest part. So if anybody's thinking about writing a book and getting it published, beware. Way back in my childhood, I use that term loosely. Way back when I was a very junior officer, I had a collateral duty as a public information officer. And there was a industry standard for use of the English language in publications. It was called the Chicago Manual of Style. The Chicago Manual of Style at that time, it was the 3rd edition, and they did things like capitalizing the word president when you're referring to the president of the United States, commanding officer, other working titles, etc. Well, there is now apparently the 17th edition, and the very first edit from the manuscript editor came back with all kinds of hash marks that said, we just can't do this. They don't want to capitalize the word Navy when we're referring to the U.S. Navy. If we say U.S. Navy, yes, it's capitalized. If it's Navy, no. Coast Guard is the same way. We can't capitalize Coast Guard unless you say U.S. Coast Guard. And there were other things like military time is written characteristically in all straight numbers, like 0200 is 2 o'clock in the morning. And they wanted to put colons in between, European style. So as a result, we almost came to a total impasse. And I actually told my wife, I said, I'm done with this. We're not going to go any further. I had gotten all this way, and then all of a sudden, I can't put out a book about the United States Coast Guard and then have Coast Guard and commanding officer, officer in charge, operations officer, all of those in lowercase, when in fact that there's a manual of style that the military itself uses. It's just the opposite. If anything, old style, where they actually do capitalize Coast Guard. So that went on for almost 3 months. We were at a total standstill. We made some concessions. They made some concessions. We were able to capitalize the word Coast Guard, and then we moved on. There was one hang up, and COVID didn't help this a bit. In the book, we mentioned that there is a movie, The Guardian, and it was a Disney movie. It starred Kevin Costner and Ashton Kutcher. And there's a sidebar I'll mention on that. It was quite interesting, but about a third of that film was filmed at Coast Guard Air Station and Coast Guard Base, Elizabeth City. And I wanted to use the movie poster for that. And Disney first said, well, okay. And then they said, well, no, we have to have the request come through the publisher, which is okay, which we did. And then it just disappeared because Disney laid off just about everybody in their theme parks and their administration as well. Long story short, we finally got it. We got actually authority to use that thing about 3 or 4 days before my text deadline. So that worked out very, very well. There were a couple after action things, and I'll get into the story itself. But I tell you what, let's do the after action things later. The rescue, if you haven't read the book, involves the Seabreeze 1. Seabreeze 1 had many prior lives and prior names. At one time, she was Disney's big red boat. It was actually owned by Premier, and they had a contract with Disneyland, Disney World out of Orlando, and they had Disney characters, and they really were the very first company to attract families with children, specifically young children, with things for them to do aboard the ship. And by that time, the Seabreeze was well over 50 years old, and at the end of her life, an old style cruise ship. She did have some modern features. Her bridge was kept up to date, but she had the original engines that came out in the mid 50s. And it was a one-class ship. They didn't have a lot of different classes that you could get on. And they usually would just sail along the eastern seaboard And later, after the big red boat was sold, Premier kept it. She kept her name, Seabreeze 1, and she started one-class service along the eastern seaboard from Florida all the way up to the Canadian Maritimes. The shipping company got in financial trouble, and in November of the year 2000, while the ship had just left Halifax, Nova Scotia, the ship was arrested. The debtors took over the ship. She returned in the middle of the night to Halifax, Nova Scotia. They woke up the passengers and told them to get off the boat. And then they had a new owner, but the ship was in Halifax. The ship remained at Halifax for almost 30 days with a skeleton crew. And then finally, the new owners decided to bring it to Charleston. And there's some question marks about what happened here in terms of sailing directions, and I'll get to that in a second. But the objective was for the skeleton crew of 34 to take her down from Halifax to Charleston with a fuel and stores as food and provisions stop in Boston. And she left Boston on a Friday, very, very late, and the weather forecast for that particular time showed that there were going to be gale warnings. And one of the mysteries is still unsolved today is if you're going to leave Boston, and in shipping, like anything else, the time is money, you pretty much want to have a straight line downbound along the East Coast. And it's discretionary as how far the captain wants to take the ship off of the coast. But regardless, the further off coast you go, the more time it takes to get off coast and then back on into Charleston. And this particular rescue happened at about 270 statute miles offshore. And as I mentioned, the question still remains why she was so far offshore at that particular time. But on Sunday, on December 17th, the year 2000, also happened to be Wright Brothers Day, which the military services and to a certain extent the historical aviation community will celebrate with a flyover. And Coast Guard Air Station Elizabeth City always gets tasked with representing the Coast Guard during this flyover ceremony. And the morning of the ceremony, the weather was so bad that the general coming in from Colorado to officiate for the Air Force for this particular ceremony was unable to land. He was in a C-37, which is a Gulfstream 5. At any rate, there was an additional crew in at the Coast Guard Air Station this day of a C-130 and an H-60 helicopter. And their whole mission, this was aside from the ready crew for search and rescue and other things, their whole mission was just to go to the flyover. They're going to do that early in the morning, then go home and watch football. The ready crew consisted of one H-60 helicopter crew and one C-130 aircraft crew, and a small amount of support staff at the air station because it was Sunday. And when the oncoming watch, Commander Holman, Charlie Holman was the oncoming watch commander, the first thing they did was set the heavy weather bill. They scrubbed a bunch of flights that were discretionary, such as law enforcement flights, and then kind of hunkered down to wait to see how the event was going. The weather was so bad, they decided not to fly the C-130 to the Wright Brothers Memorial flyover. But the second helicopter, which was there just for that event, decided to take off, and they did actually use an H-60. At that time, there was lightning and thunder throughout. The forecast said there was a possibility of tornadoes for a nor'easter moving up the eastern seaboard. At about 11:29 that morning, a satellite telephone communication came into the RCC, the Rescue Coordination Center at Portsmouth, saying that there was a ship sinking 276 miles off the coast, skeleton crew of 34. The Rescue Coordination Center called Air Stations Elizabeth City and said, conduct a rescue. At that time, the ready crews jumped in, the helicopter and the C-130 were essentially airborne at the same time. Within 31 minutes of the call, the C-130 was in the air. At 276 miles off coast, that's nothing for the C-130 because of their extended range capabilities. But with the helicopter, that was right at the end of their operational radius. They actually put on an external fuel tank so they could carry as much fuel as they could. You'll get a lot more detail as you read the book, but essentially they arrived. The headwinds, the tailwinds were so strong that the helicopter arrived in about an hour and a half. Once the helicopter gets there, they see how dire the situation is. We had to fill in some gaps, and there was some video available from the Coast Guard. The captain of the ship was desperately trying to turn the ship into the wind. When the C-130 arrived, the ship had a 20-degree list to port. And in the minute they switched over and turned the vessel into the wind, there was so much water in the ship, she took on a 40-degree roll and had a 20-degree list to starboard. The crew at that time was panicked, and the on-scene commander, Commander Charlie Holman, directed the crew, the captain, to have the crew assemble on the fantail or the aft portion of the ship for a helicopter hoist. And this was done. The first helicopter came in, and I should mention the rescue swimmer's name is Darren Reeves. And he told me when I did the interview, we did 5 different personal interviews for this, trips for this to write the book. Darren told me that in his entire career of the rescue swimmer in the Coast Guard, he had never seen waves like that. He said he's been swimming in 30-foot waves in the Pacific. And when he got out there, he admitted he was scared. At any rate, they put him down, got him on the ship, and then immediately the crew charged the basket. Some of the crew members had knives, demanding to get in first, and that brought an all-stop to everything. They thought about hauling Darren Reeves back up to the helicopter until some order and discipline was established. Charlie Holman screamed at the master of the ship, "You have to establish order and discipline, otherwise this isn't going to go well." He had to do that on 3 occasions. Darren Reeves, on deck now, decided he was going to have to take control of the situation. He went and disarmed the person that had this. It was a large hunting knife, and he just threw the knife overboard. That did give some order for a while to it. But when Darren saw that the crew of the ship itself was absolutely panicked, and they knew the ship better than, of course, the aircraft crew did, he thought too that he might be, his safety might be endangered. And he got the idea that since the hoist on a helicopter can carry 600 pounds of weight, he, for the first time, never been done before, put 2 adults in the basket at once. Since the first helicopter did not know the arrival time of the second helicopter, and that was the one that did the flyover for the Wright Brothers event. And by the way, they didn't have enough gas either. They had to put an external fuel tank on as well. They weren't sure when the arrival of the second helicopter would be, and because of the condition of the ship, feeling it could roll over at any particular time, they just kept loading people into the helicopter. It wasn't until the co-pilot, Craig Neubecker, said to the pilot, Lieutenant Dan Multham, that they were at bingo fuel, which means we have enough fuel to get back, but if we stay any longer, it's going to be a real problem. Once they decided they were at bingo fuel, they decided they had to cut off the hoist. And they directed the rescue swimmer on the deck of the ship to come up, and he demurred. He said, "I'd like to service the second helicopter." Dan was, the pilot was worried about his safety, thinking if the ship that rolled over, there's very little he could do. He directed him to come up, and when Darren Reeves got to the door of the helicopter, there was essentially no room. And he ended up getting on top of everybody in order to close the helicopter door to get back. The helicopter which spent an hour and a half getting out because of a tailwind, now had to go through the same storm, and it took 2.5 hours to get back. And by the time they got to Naval Air Station Oceana, they were able to determine that they got 26 people, in addition to the flight crew of 4, into an H-60 helicopter. The previous record, by the way, was 13 people. So they got back, they got home safely. The second helicopter picked up the rest of the crew, 8 people, and it was a very, very good and a very, very impressive rescue. And just to put a little bit of interest in the whole thing, the helicopter crews, when they got back, they got to go home. The C-130 time, they had not been bagged out, which is a military term saying they have still can fly on their duty day. And so they went back to after the rescue to Air Station Elizabeth City and stood the remainder of their watch. So that's essentially what happened in the rescue. It was pretty exciting. There are other details that came up during the thing. The helicopter got hit by a wave, knocking out their automatic flight control system, not once, but 6 times. That's how bad the weather was at the time on scene. So at any rate, it's an excellent story. I think it shows 2 things. Number one, my objective of writing a book was not to make money. As a matter of fact, I thought for a while if the royalties came in high enough, I would just donate those to the Coast Guard Museum. My real objective was to write the book to show the public what the Coast Guard does for them. And then lastly, right now, I'm kind of been watching the ratings because this is the first time I've actually put a book out that has been by a publisher for sale. And Amazon did pick it up and gave me the lowest rating, which was a 4. Everything else has come in higher than that. The book is also available on barnesandnoble.com, and Walmart picked it up last week. So we're delighted. As I say, the whole objective was to get the story out to the public. It was a delight writing. It was a challenge publishing. That's about it.
Okay. And Mr. Moore, I believe you had the honor of recognizing the crew at the Smithsonian. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, sure. I was working for, I was a direct report, which means my boss is a 3-star admiral by the name of John Score. And the flight crew got all kinds of awards. As a matter of fact, this particular rescue was on the front page of the Washington Post above the fold the next morning. All of the morning shows today, CBS, whatever, had the air crew on the next morning. And keep in mind, these guys had very little sleep. But at any rate, it was a lot of great coverage the day and the weeks following the actual rescue. The Aviation Week and Aerospace magazine sponsors an event every year at the Smithsonian, the Air and Space Museum at the Smithsonian. And they have a laureate award of operational excellence. If you look at the people who have received that, astronauts in the past, some incredible pilots who have done miraculous things, either in war or at other times. So it's a very, very prestigious thing, and it was a black tie event requiring our dress uniform. And Admiral Score called me. He had a hard conflict. He says, "We really need someone there to make the introduction for the flight crew." And so I said, I'd be glad to do that. I called my aide, Becky Hetherington, and I said, I've got to get smart on this. I heard about the rescue, but I got to talk to the flight crew. I want to meet them in advance. And so we got there. I sat next to Buzz Aldrin. We were very, very proud to introduce the flight crew who actually performed that rescue in the first helicopter, and just really, really proud that they received that very prestigious award. And then to come back to what I said very much earlier, when I saw the movie The Finest Hours, I said, here's an overloaded boat. I know knowledge now of an overloaded helicopter, that saved an incredible number of lives. And it was as a result of the Smithsonian event that I had that knowledge.
Okay. If you're joining us through Zoom, if you would like to type your question for Mr. Moore through the chat or through Q&A, or if we have any questions from the audience or our in-person guests, that would be great. Yes.
When did the boat finally sink?
When did the boat finally sink?
The Discovery Channel said that it sank within 15 minutes of the last helicopter leaving. We are uncertain as to when it happened. Here's why. The second C-130 arrived, and that was the second C-130, keep in mind, was scheduled to fly over the Wright Brothers event and was scrubbed due to weather. Second C-130 arrived, and the first C-130 on-scene commander, Charlie Holman, said, "I'm not sure, the count isn't right." They had no good head count to tell him that 34 people were taken off that ship. So he told the second C-130 when it arrived to get low, vibrate the hull plates, make noise. If there's anybody in the ship, tell us, and we'll get a third helicopter in there. That didn't happen, but the second C-130 left the scene probably 20 to 30 minutes after the first C-130, and all the helicopters were gone. It reported that it was still listing, taking seas broadside, and then they departed the scene. And although the Discovery Channel said it happened within 15 minutes, that's still uncertain. They launched a C-130 from Coast Guard Air Station the next day, feeling that if she was still afloat, she would be a hazard to navigation because she is underway but not under command. That's the term that they use. And you have a ship that's 600-foot ship floating around the Atlantic with nobody aboard, could be a hazard to navigation. So in the morning, the next day, they launched a C-130. They took her last reported position. They went out there and they found lifeboats. One was 4 lifeboats upright, empty, 1 lifeboat overturned, the deck chairs, other flotsam that would indicate that it was a cruise ship that went down. There was no oil slick. However, they did find enough in the general area to indicate that the ship went down. So sometime between that time in the morning and probably about 4 p.m. The afternoon before, the ship actually did sink, but it's quite uncertain as to whether or not it sank 15 minutes after the last helicopter left.
Will we have any more questions? So if anyone online happens to remember, does anyone online or in person remember the event? So, okay. So as we can see, our Coast Guard, they go way beyond the duties that they are trained for through this event and through many other events that we can read about and hear about. Any other comments today?
I just had one more comment.
Okay.
I've been telling all my friends reading the book, and I would never do this. And I guess, I don't know if this is typical of the American book reader, but usually when I read a book, when I get to the acknowledgement section, I'm done. And for those that are going to get the book or read the book, I would really encourage you to read the acknowledgement section. There are little stories about each individual in there as well. So just a little bit of advice.
Okay. And I will also add too that we, the museum shop here, we do have the book for sale in the museum shop. So you're more than welcome to pick up a copy in our museum shop here at the museum. Okay. Yes, sir. Okay, I still see no more questions, but we would like to thank everyone for coming out today in person and virtually. We would also like to thank Mr. Moore for joining us all the way from California today. I guess this is the advantage to having a virtual program now. We can actually have guest speakers from a distance, and when we were first arranging this program, we were like Easter Standard Time. So this virtual programming does make a difference for us, and it allows us to bring guest speakers from a distance. Again, we would like to thank everyone for coming out, and we hope to see you on November the 17th. And thank you, Mr. Moore, for joining us today.
And thank you for putting it together.